the quiet village of Chipping Norbury, a jewelled dagger, cursed and priceless, vanishes from Norbury Hall, sparking a web of secrets and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and gentle demeanour, unravels a tale of greed, fear, and betrayal. A scream pierces the night, a rouged smudge betrays a thief, and hidden panels conceal dark truths. As motives unravel and alibis crumble, Miss Marple sets a trap to catch a cunning culprit. Will the dagger's curse claim another victim, or will her sharp mind bring justice to light? Dive into a classic mystery where every clue counts. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Chipping Norbury. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the window of her neat little cottage in Chipping Norbury, a village that nestled quietly in the folds of the English countryside, its thatched roofs and winding lanes untouched by the clamour of modernity. The late summer sun cast a golden glow through the lace curtains, illuminating the delicate china teacup on the table beside her and the soft pink wool she was knitting into a shawl. Her fingers, nimble despite their years, moved with the steady rhythm of long habit. But her sharp blue eyes were fixed on a letter, freshly opened, its crisp paper bearing the crest of Norbury Hall. The letter was from Lady Celia Ashford, the young and somewhat flighty wife of Sir Henry Ashford, a retired diplomat whose family had owned Norbury Hall for generations. The invitation, written in Celia's looping hand, requested Miss Marple's presence for a weekend gathering to celebrate the unveiling of Sir Henry's latest acquisition, a jewelled dagger from an ancient dynasty, reputed to carry a curse. The words were warm, almost effusive, but Miss Marple's keen intuition detected a faint undercurrent of strain. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter read, "your presence would so delight us, and I feel your wisdom might comfort me." That pause, implied by the ink's slight smudge, spoke volumes to Miss Marple. "Something is troubling her," she murmured, her needles clicking softly. "Something she cannot quite name." Chipping Norbury was not unlike other villages Miss Marple had known, full of gossip and secrets where every garden gate hid a story. But Norbury Hall was its crown, a sprawling Elizabethan manor with ivy-draped walls, leaded windows, and a reputation for mystery. Sir Henry, a man of 60 with a soldier's bearing and a collector's obsession, was known for his treasures, from rare manuscripts to exotic relics. This dagger, Miss Marple gathered from village talk, was his pride, though whispers of its curse had already stirred unease among the maids and shopkeepers. Cursed or not, Miss Marple thought, folding the letter, people make their own troubles. She accepted the invitation with a polite note, packing her sensible tweed skirt, a lavender cardigan, and one evening dress of understated elegance. Black, with a touch of lace, for one never knew when formality might be required. On Friday afternoon, a car from the hall arrived, driven by a taciturn man named Hodges, who tipped his cap but said little. The drive through Chipping Norbury's lanes, past the church with its lopsided steeple, and the Rose and Crown pub, ended at the hall's iron gates, which opened onto a gravel drive lined with ancient yews. The hall itself was as grand as Miss Marple expected, its stone facade softened by roses climbing the walls. Lady Celia greeted her at the door, her delicate features framed by auburn curls, her smile bright but brittle. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm so glad you've come," she exclaimed, her hands fluttering like startled birds. Sir Henry, standing behind her, offered a firm handshake, his grey eyes appraising. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," he said. "I trust you'll find our little gathering diverting." The other guests were already assembled in the oak-panelled drawing-room, where a fire crackled despite the mild weather. Major Reginald Blake, a ruddy-faced man with a limp and a booming voice, was recounting a campaign in India over a glass of brandy. Miss Lavinia Gray, a spinster of indeterminate age with a sharp nose and sharper wit, sat scribbling in a notebook, her novels published under the name L.V. Grenville, a poorly kept secret. Mr. Victor Langston, a sleek art dealer with dark hair and a smile that lingered too long, leaned against the mantel, charming but watchful. Dr. Evelyn Hurst, a bespectacled archaeologist with a quiet intensity, stood apart, studying a vase as if it held the key to some ancient riddle. Tea was served, with delicate sandwiches and scones that Miss Marple nibbled politely while observing the room. Major Blake's anecdotes grew louder with each sip of brandy. Miss Gray's pen scratched furiously, pausing only to cast sly glances at Celia. Langston's flattery made Celia blush, though her eyes darted to Sir Henry, and Dr. Hurst, when questioned about the dagger, spoke briefly of its unsettling provenance. Miss Marple, her expression mild, noted the undercurrents. Celia's nervous laugh, Sir Henry's tight grip on his teacup, the way Langston's gaze followed the maid as she cleared the plates. That evening, after a dinner of roast pheasant and claret, Sir Henry led the party to the drawing-room for the unveiling. The dagger rested in a glass case, its hilt studded with rubies that caught the chandelier's light, its blade etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the shadows. "A masterpiece," Sir Henry declared, his voice proud but edged with something else. Caution, perhaps, from a lost empire, and said to bring misfortune to those who covet it. The guests murmured, some in awe, others uneasy. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her sherry, saw Celia's hand tremble. Langston's eyes narrow, and Dr. Hurst's lips press into a thin line. As the party dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the dagger's case. The lock was intricate, the glass polished, but a faint scratch near the base caught her eye. Curious, she thought, her mind already threading together the evening's impressions. A nervous hostess, a watchful guest, a relic with a dark reputation. People, she said softly to herself, are never quite what they seem. Retiring to her room, a cosy chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the moonlit gardens, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The hall was silent, but she sensed the stirrings of something deeper, a secret waiting to surface, like a bubble in a still pond. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "will be most illuminating." Chapter 2. A Scream in the Night. The clock in Miss Jane Marple's room at Norbury Hall struck midnight, its chimes muffled by the heavy drapes and the weight of the old house's silence. She had not yet retired, though the rest of the household had bid their good nights an hour earlier, dispersing to their rooms after Sir Henry's dramatic unveiling of the jewelled dagger. Miss Marple, seated in a chintz-covered chair by the window, her knitting idle in her lap, was alert to the night's stillness. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, scanned the darkened gardens below, where moonlight silvered the yew hedges. She had learned, over many years of observing human nature, that the hours after midnight often revealed what daylight concealed. It was then that the scream pierced the quiet, a high, sharp cry, unmistakably female, that seemed to come from the upper floor. It was brief, cut off as though stifled, but it set Miss Marple's heart beating a little faster, not from fear but from curiosity. She rose, her movements brisk despite her age, and wrapped a woolen shawl about her shoulders. Her slippers, soft-soled and silent, carried her to the door, which she opened with care. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by a single sconce, casting long shadows on the oak-panelled walls. Other doors were opening now, and voices murmured in the gloom. Major Reginald Blake appeared first, his face flushed, a poker gripped in his hand, as though he expected to confront a burglar. "What the devil was that?" he barked, his military bluster only half masking his unease. Miss Lavinia Gray emerged next, her hair in curlers, a dressing gown clutched tightly about her thin frame, her eyes darting suspiciously. "Someone's playing tricks," she snapped, though her voice trembled. Mr. Victor Langston, curiously immaculate in a silk dressing gown, stepped into the corridor, his expression one of calculated concern. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his tone too smooth for Miss Marple's liking. Dr. Evelyn Hurst, her face pale and her glasses slightly askew, lingered at her door, saying nothing but watching intently. At the top of the grand staircase stood Lady Celia Ashford, her auburn hair loose, her nightgown a ghostly white in the dim light, her hands twisted together, and her eyes were wide with something that might have been fear or guilt. "It was nothing," she said, her voice high and unsteady. "A nightmare, I think. I'm so sorry to have disturbed you all." Her words were met with murmurs of relief, but Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted the way Celia's gaze flickered toward the drawing-room below, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Sir Henry appeared last, his dressing gown hastily tied, his grey hair dishevelled. "Back to bed, all of you," he said gruffly, his tone more weary than commanding. "No need for this fuss over a bad dream." He took Celia's arm, guiding her back to their room, but not before Miss Marple caught the glance they exchanged, his stern, hers almost pleading. The guests dispersed, Major Blake muttering about nerves, Miss Gray clutching her notebook as if it were a talisman, and Langston offering a gallant but unnecessary arm to Dr. Hurst, who declined it with a curt nod. Miss Marple returned to her room but did not sleep. She sat by the window, her mind turning over the scream, the reactions, the fleeting expressions. A nightmare, perhaps, she thought, but nightmares don't leave such a mark of fear. She recalled Celia's trembling hands, Langston's too perfect composure, and the way Dr. Hurst's silence seemed to hold more weight than the other's words. "Something is stirring in this house," she murmured, "and it's not just the wind." Morning broke with a grey drizzle, the gardens of Norbury Hall shrouded in mist. At breakfast, the mood was strained, the clink of cutlery on china louder than the conversation. Sir Henry, presiding at the head of the table, was preoccupied, his eyes fixed on his coffee. Celia, pale and subdued, toyed with a piece of toast, her smiles forced. The guests, too, were uneasy. Major Blake grumbled about the damp, Miss Gray scribbled furiously, and Langston's charm seemed dimmed, his glances sharp and searching. Dr. Hurst, as ever, was reserved, her attention on a book of archaeological notes she'd brought to the table. It was Jenny, the young maid, who broke the news. She entered the dining room, her face white, her hands twisting in her apron. "Sir Henry," she stammered, "the dagger, it's gone." A collective gasp rose from the table. Sir Henry stood, his chair scraping the floor, and strode to the drawing-room, the others trailing behind. The glass case stood empty, its lock intact, the velvet lining mocking in its emptiness. "Impossible!" Sir Henry roared, his face reddening. "The case was locked, the room secured." Celia clutched his arm, her eyes brimming with tears. "Henry, how could this happen?" she whispered. Major Blake swore under his breath, Miss Grey's pen froze, and Langston's lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. Dr. Hurst, standing by the window, said nothing, but her fingers tightened on her book. Miss Marple, lingering near the case, bent slightly, her eyes catching a faint smudge of rouge on the glass's edge, and a series of scuff marks on the carpet, leading toward the French windows. Most interesting, she thought, straightening up. Constable Polk, a stout man with an earnest face and a slow manner, arrived within the hour, summoned by a frantic telephone call from Celia. He examined the case, took notes, and questioned the guests, his pencil moving laboriously across his notebook. Major Blake claimed he'd been in his room, nursing a headache with a glass of brandy. Miss Grey insisted she'd been writing until the small hours, her door locked. Langston admitted to a midnight stroll in the gardens to clear my head, he said with a disarming smile. Dr. Hurst said she'd been in the library, studying Sir Henry's collection of manuscripts, and had seen no one. Celia, tearful, could only repeat that her scream had been a dream, nothing more. Miss Marple, seated in a corner of the drawing room with her knitting, listened to the alibis with a polite smile. She noted the contradictions. Langston's polished shoes, despite his claim of walking in the damp gardens. Miss Grey's insistence on a locked door, though Jenny had mentioned seeing her in the corridor. Dr. Hurst's precise account, delivered with a hesitancy that suggested more knowledge than she shared. The smudge of rouge intrigued her most. None of the women admitted to wearing it, yet there it was, a faint pink stain that spoke of carelessness or haste. As Polk bumbled through his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the dagger itself. Its curse, whispered about in the village, was nonsense, of course. Yet it had stirred something in this house. Fear, greed, or perhaps something deeper? She recalled Sir Henry's pride, Celia's unease, the way the guests had watched the dagger under the chandelier's glow. People, she thought, her needles clicking softly, are so very careless with their secrets. The rain continued, casting a pall over Norbury Hall. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her eyes on the empty case. The scuff marks, the rouge, the locked case with no sign of tampering. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was adept at fitting such pieces together. Someone, she said to herself, has been very clever, but not quite clever enough. Chapter 3. The Weight of Motives. The drizzle had thickened into a steady rain by mid-morning, cloaking Norbury Hall in a grey veil that seemed to mirror the unease within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a cosy space with faded chintz curtains and a low fire sputtering against the damp. Her knitting lay in her lap, the soft pink wool forming a half-finished shawl, but her attention was fixed on the guests who had gathered under the pretense of reading or conversation. The air was heavy with suspicion, the theft of the jewelled dagger casting a shadow over the household. Constable Polk had departed an hour earlier, his notebook filled with scribbled alibis, and his brow furrowed with the effort of making sense of them. His investigation, earnest but plodding, had yielded little beyond a list of contradictory statements and a vague promise to look into things. Miss Marple, her hands idle but her mind sharp, had listened to his questions with her usual polite attention, noting the way each guest responded, or failed to respond, to his inquiries. Poor man, she thought. He sees the surface, but not the currents beneath. Major Reginald Blake, sprawled in an armchair with a copy of the Times, was the loudest in his indignation. "Damned cheek, stealing from a man's own home!" he growled, his face redder than usual. Though whether from anger or brandy, Miss Marple could not be sure. He had repeated his alibi, alone in his room, nursing a headache, but his eyes flicked too often toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. Miss Lavinia Gray, perched at a writing desk, scratched away at her notebook, her lips pursed. She had claimed to be writing late into the night, but her insistence on a locked door struck Miss Marple as oddly emphatic. Mr. Victor Langston, lounging by the window with a cigarette, offered occasional quips, his charm undimmed but his gaze watchful. Dr. Evelyn Hurst, her archaeological notes spread before her, said little, her silence a contrast to the other's volubility. Lady Celia, pale and restless, flitted about, offering tea no one wanted, her hands betraying a nervous tremor. Sir Henry, meanwhile, had retreated to his study after a heated exchange with Pork, his temper frayed by the theft. "The man's useless," he had muttered, slamming the door. Celia's eyes had followed him, her expression a mix of worry and something deeper, resignation perhaps. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed it all, her mind weaving the threads of the morning's events, the empty case, the smudge of rouge, the scuff marks on the carpet. It's the little things, she thought, that always betray them. The conversation, such as it was, turned to the Dagger. Major Blake, tossing aside his newspaper, launched into a tirade about lax security. "In my day, we'd have had guards posted, locks checked," he declared, though Miss Marple suspected his military days were less disciplined than he claimed. Miss Gray, pausing her writing, suggested Sir Henry's finances might be strained, her tone implying more than her words. "Collections like his cost money," she said, her eyes glinting. "Perhaps he was planning to sell the Dagger." The accusation hung in the air, and Celia's teacup rattled in its saucer. Langston, with a laugh that was too light, dismissed the idea. "Sir Henry, sell his prize? Never. The man's besotted with his relics." But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped the arm of Woe, his chair. Dr. Hurst, roused from her silence, spoke quietly. "The Dagger's history is unsettling," she said. "Its curse isn't mere folklore. The last owner met a bad end, and the one before that." Her voice was steady, but her hands, adjusting her glasses, betrayed a slight shake. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "A curse," she thought, "is only as real as the fear it inspires." Seeking a moment's quiet, Miss Marple excused herself and wandered to the drawing-room, where the empty case stood like a silent accusation. The scuff marks, faint but distinct, led to the French windows, their latch showing signs of wear. She bent to examine the carpet, her fingers brushing the fibres. The marks suggested a hurried movement, perhaps someone carrying something heavy or concealing it. The rouge smudge on the case, pink and powdery, was another puzzle. Celia wore no makeup last night. Miss Gray favoured a severe look, and Dr. Hurst seemed unlikely to bother with cosmetics. "Someone," Miss Marple murmured, "is not what they seem." She sought out Jenny, the maid, finding her polishing silver in the pantry. Jenny was a slight girl, with nervous eyes and a habit of biting her lip. Under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, she admitted to hearing footsteps after the scream. Light, quick steps, not the heavy tread of a man. "I didn't dare look," Jenny whispered, glancing at the door. "I thought it might be, well, you know, the curse." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No curse, my dear," she said. "Only people making mischief." She pressed further, asking about the guests' habits. Jenny hesitated, then mentioned Miss Gray's request for extra candles, claiming a fear of the dark. Odd for a writer, Miss Marple thought, filing the detail away. Returning to the morning room, Miss Marple took tea with Celia, who seemed on the verge of collapse. "Henry's so angry," Celia confided, her voice low. "He's been different since that dagger arrived. Secretive, always locking his study. I'm afraid, Miss Marple." Her eyes, wide and pleading, held a story she wasn't ready to tell. Miss Marple patted her hand. "Fear makes us see shadows," she said, "but shadows can be dispelled." She did not add that shadows often hid truths, but her mind was already turning over Celia's words. The locked study, the dagger's hold over Sir Henry. As the day wore on, the guests' tensions surfaced. Major Blake accused Langston of knowing shady types in the art world. A charge Langston deflected with a laugh. Miss Grey, her novelist's imagination unchecked, hinted at darker motives, her eyes lingering on Celia. Dr. Hurst, when pressed, admitted the dagger's value was immense, both monetarily and historically. "But it's the history that matters," she said, her voice tight. "It's dangerous in the wrong hands." Miss Marple, knitting quietly, noted the edge in her tone. The rain eased by afternoon, but the atmosphere in Norbury Hall remained charged. Miss Marple, her shawl about her shoulders, took a turn in the garden, her eyes on the French windows. The latch, she confirmed, could be forced with ease, a fact someone in the house likely knew. It's always the little things, she thought. The latch, the rouge, the candles. They tell the story, if one listens. As she returned to the hall, her mind was busy, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that was, she sensed, only beginning to take shape. Chapter 4. The Clue in the Carpet. The rain had ceased by late morning, leaving the gardens of Norbury Hall glistening under a weak sun. Inside, the atmosphere remained taut, the theft of the jewelled dagger casting a pall over the household. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her bag, slipped away from the morning room where the guests lingered, their conversations stilted and edged with suspicion. She had no patience for their posturing today. Her mind was fixed on the drawing room, where the empty case stood as a mute challenge. The truth, she thought, is always in the details. The drawing room was quiet, its heavy curtains drawn back to admit the pale light. The glass case, bereft of its treasure, gleamed under the chandelier, its lock untouched, the velvet lining pristine save for the faint smudge of rouge Miss Marple had noted earlier. She bent closer, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The smudge, pink and powdery, was not the work of a careless servant. It was too deliberate, too close to the lock. "A woman's touch," she murmured. "But whose?" None of the women, Lady Celia, Miss Grey or Dr. Hurst, had worn such a shade at dinner. Yet the mark was fresh, likely from the night of the theft. Her gaze shifted to the carpet, where the scuff marks she'd observed yesterday told their own story. They were faint, a series of irregular scratches leading from the case to the French windows. Kneeling with care, her knees protested, but her curiosity was stronger. She traced the marks with a gloved finger. The carpet's pile was disturbed, as if someone had dragged a heavy object or moved in haste. The windows, framed by heavy drapes, opened onto the terrace, and the latch, as she'd suspected, was loose, its screws worn from frequent use. Not a forced entry, she thought, but an exit, perhaps. Miss Marple stood, brushing her skirt, and examined the room further. A small table near the windows held a vase of late roses, their petals wilting. Beneath it, caught in the carpet's fringe, was a single thread of dark blue wool, barely visible. She plucked it carefully, holding it to the light. It was coarser than her own knitting wool, more like the sort used for mending or embroidery. "Curious," she said softly, tucking the thread into her handkerchief. "Very curious indeed." Returning to the household, she sought out Jenny, the maid who was polishing brass in the back hall. Jenny's eyes widened at Miss Marple's approach, her hands fumbling with the cloth. "Oh, miss, you startled me," she said, her voice high. Miss Marple smiled, her manner as soothing as a cup of tea. "No need to fret, my dear," she said. "I only wondered if you'd noticed anything odd that night, besides the scream, of course." Jenny hesitated, her lip caught between her teeth. "Well," she said at last, "there was Miss Grey, asking for candles. Said she was afraid of the dark, which seemed queer, her being so sharp-like. And I saw her in the corridor, after the scream, though she said she never left her room." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new piece. "And did anyone else ask for candles, Jenny?" The maid shook her head. "No, miss, just her. The others were quiet, though Mr. Langston was up late, I think. I heard the floor creak near his room." Miss Marple thanked her, slipping her a shilling for her trouble, and returned to the morning room, where the guests were now scattered, their alibis fraying like old fabric. Lunch was a subdued affair, the clink of cutlery loud in the silence. Sir Henry, his temper barely contained, spoke little, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Lady Celia, pale and drawn, picked at her food, her glances darting to her husband. Major Blake, his bluster subdued, muttered about thieves in the night. Miss Grey, her notebook ever present, scribbled with a fervour that suggested more than literary inspiration. Langston, his charm strained, made light remarks that fell flat, while Dr. Hurst, as usual, kept her own counsel, her archaeological notes a shield against the tension. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, watched them all. Miss Grey's insistence on a locked door now seemed less convincing, given Jenny's account. Langston's late-night movements were equally intriguing. His claim of a garden stroll felt flimsy, his shoes too clean for the muddy paths. Dr. Hurst's silence, too, was telling. Her knowledge of the dagger's history suggested a motive Miss Marple had yet to unravel. People, she thought, are so careless when they think no one is watching. After lunch, she took tea with Celia in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and the scent of damp earth. Celia, her hands twisting in her lap, seemed on the verge of confession. "I can't bear it, Miss Marple," she whispered. "Henry's obsessed with that dagger. He locks himself in his study, muttering about its value, its secrets. I think he's afraid of it." Her eyes filled with tears, and Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Fear can cloud the mind," she said, "but it also reveals truths. What is it you're not saying, my dear?" Celia shook her head, her lips trembling. "It's nothing really, just I wish we'd never brought that thing here." Miss Marple did not press, but her mind noted the weight of Celia's words, the way her fear seemed tied to more than the dagger's curse. A marriage, she thought, can be its own kind of prison. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her eyes lingering on the French windows. The latch's wear suggested frequent use, perhaps a servant's shortcut, or something more deliberate. The blue thread, the rouge smudge, the scuff marks. They were pieces of a puzzle, each pointing to a presence in the room that night. She recalled Miss Grey's candles, Langston's creaking floorboards, Celia's scream. Someone, she thought, planned this carefully. but plans have a way of unravelling. As the day waned, the household prepared for dinner, the guests donning their masks of civility. Miss Marple, her shawl about her shoulders, joined them, her expression mild, but her mind alert. The dagger was gone, but its shadow remained, stirring secrets that would not stay hidden for long. It's always the little things, she thought, her needles clicking softly as she sat by the fire, that led one to the truth. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Curse. The second night at Norbury Hall descended with a hush, as if the house itself held its breath after the tumult of the dagger's theft. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with her knitting untouched, listened to the distant creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of the wind against the windows. The guests had retired early, their nerves frayed by suspicion, and Constable Polk's fruitless inquiries. Yet Miss Marple, ever wakeful, sensed that the night was far from done revealing its secrets. Dinner had been a strained affair, the dining room's candlelight casting flickering shadows on the panelled walls. Sir Henry, his face etched with worry, had spoken little, his fork moving mechanically through the poached salmon. Lady Celia, her eyes red-rimmed, had excused herself before dessert, murmuring about a headache. Major Reginald Blake, his brandy glass never far from hand, had grumbled about the incompetence of the local police. Miss Lavinia Gray, her sharp eyes missing nothing, had made pointed remarks about hidden motives, her pen scratching even at the table. Mr. Victor Langston, his charm now brittle, had deflected questions with forced laughter, while Dr. Evelyn Hurst, as reticent as ever, had offered a single comment about the dagger's curse, her voice low and precise. "It's not a myth," she had said, her gaze fixed on her plate. "The dagger has a history of ruin." Miss Marple, nibbling her pudding, had noted the undercurrents. Celia's abrupt departure, Blake's restless hands, Gray's probing glances, Langston's strained smile, Hurst's cryptic warning. The curse, she thought, was a convenient fiction, a way to cloak human greed or fear in superstition. People, she mused, love to blame fate for their own misdeeds. She had retired early, claiming fatigue, but instead of sleeping, she positioned her chair by the door, her ears attuned to the house's nocturnal stirrings. At 1:30, a faint sound broke the silence. A soft tread in the corridor, deliberate but cautious. Miss Marple, her shawl about her shoulders, opened her door a crack. A figure moved in the shadows, too tall for Celia, too slight for Blake, vanishing toward the library's heavy oak door. She slipped into the corridor, her slippers silent on the polished floor, and followed, her heart steady despite the hour. The library door was ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling into the hall. Peering inside, she saw Victor Langston, his silk dressing gown catching the light, rifling through the drawers of Sir Henry's desk. Papers rustled, and a soft curse escaped his lips as he found nothing. "Looking for something, Mr. Langston?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, but it cut through the stillness like a blade. Langston started, his hand jerking from the drawer. For a moment, his face was unguarded, surprise, then a flash of calculation, before his smile returned, smooth as ever. "Miss Marple, you startled me," he said, closing the drawer with a casual air. "Just indulging my curiosity about Sir Henry's collection. He has some fine manuscripts, you know." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Curiosity is a fine thing," she said, "but it can lead one into trouble, don't you think?" Langston laughed, a touch too loudly, and excused himself, brushing past her with a nod. She watched him go, noting the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Curiosity indeed, she thought, or something more deliberate. Returning to the library, she examined the desk. The drawers were locked, but one showed signs of tampering. A faint scratch on the brass, as if a tool had been applied clumsily. The papers Langston had disturbed were catalogues of artifacts, some annotated in Sir Henry's neat hand. One entry caught her eye, a reference to a companion piece to the dagger, a medallion rumoured to complete its curse. Interesting, she murmured, replacing the papers. The library itself was a treasure trove. Shelves of leather-bound books, glass cases of relics, a faint musty scent of age. She noted a loose panel behind a bookcase, barely discernible, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. A hiding place, she thought, or an escape. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her mind weaving the night's discoveries into the growing tapestry of the case. Langston's nocturnal search suggested he knew more about the dagger than he let on. The loose panel hinted at secrets within the house itself. The rouge smudge, the scuff marks, the blue thread, Jenny's candles, all pointed to a plan, carefully laid but imperfectly executed. Someone, she thought, is playing a dangerous game. Morning brought a pale sunrise, the gardens still damp from the dew, previous day's rain. At breakfast, the tension was palpable. Sir Henry, his temper frayed, snapped at the butler over cold coffee. Celia, her face drawn, avoided his gaze, her fingers twisting a napkin. Blake, nursing a hangover, was quieter than usual, his eyes bloodshot. Miss Grey, her notebook ever present, watched the room with a novelist's hunger for drama. Langston, immaculate as ever, made light conversation, but his glances were wary. Dr. Hurst, her notes spread before her, seemed distracted, her fingers tracing the edge of a page. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the interplay. Langston's composure, she noted, was a mask. His hands, though steady, lingered too long on his cup. Miss Grey's scribbling had an urgency, as if she feared missing a detail. Dr. Hurst's distraction felt deliberate, a shield against questions. Celia's silence was the most telling. She was a woman on the edge, her fear tied to more than the dagger's loss. A house of secrets, Miss Marple thought, and not all of them about the dagger. After breakfast, she took a turn in the garden, her eyes on the French windows of the drawing room. The latch, as she'd confirmed, was worn, suggesting frequent use, perhaps by someone slipping out after the theft. The blue thread, the rouge smudge, Langston's search, they were pieces of a puzzle, each pointing to a truth just out of reach. It's always the little things, she thought, her shawl drawn tight against the morning chill. The things people overlook. As she returned to the hall, the guests were gathering for another of Polk's interviews, his questions growing more desperate. Miss Marple joined them, her expression mild, her knitting resumed. But her mind was far from idle, turning over the night's events. The hidden panel, the whispered curse, the dagger, she thought, is only the beginning. The real secret lies in what it conceals. Chapter 6. The trap is set. The third day at Norbury Hall dawned with a brittle clarity, the sky scrubbed clean by the previous day's rain, though the tension within the house remained as thick as ever. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the guests with her usual quiet attentiveness. The theft of the jewelled dagger had frayed nerves and loosened tongues, and the air crackled with unspoken accusations. Constable Polk's morning visit had done little to ease the strain, his questions circling the same alibis without piercing the surface of the truth. Poor man, Miss Marple thought, her needles clicking softly. He's fishing in a pond with no fish. The guests scattered about the room wore their unease like ill-fitting clothes. Major Reginald Blake, his face florid, paced by the window, muttering about damned thieves and the decline of English hospitality. Miss Lavinia Gray, her notebook open, scribbled with a ferocity that suggested more than literary ambition, her sharp eyes darting to each speaker. Mr. Victor Langston, his charm now threadbare, leaned against the mantel, his cigarette smoke curling upward like a question mark. Dr. Evelyn Hurst, her archaeological notes spread before her, seemed absorbed, but her fingers twitched, betraying her calm. Lady Celia, pale and silent, sat twisting a handkerchief, her gaze fixed on the floor. Sir Henry, who had joined them briefly, excused himself to his study, his expression dark with frustration. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, reviewed the threads of the puzzle. The rouge smudge on the case, the scuff marks leading to the French windows, the blue thread caught in the carpet, Jenny's tale of Miss Gray's candles, Langston's midnight search in the library, the loose panel behind the bookcase. Each was a clue, small but telling, pointing to a plan that was both bold and flawed. Someone, she thought, has underestimated the power of observation. The dagger's curse, so often mentioned, was a distraction, she was certain of it. The real motive lay in human desires, greed, fear, or perhaps something more personal. Determined to test her suspicions, Miss Marple proposed a reenactment of the first night's events. She approached Sir Henry in his study, a cluttered room of leather-bound books and artifacts, where he sat brooding over a glass of whisky. "A reenactment, Miss Marple," he said, his brow furrowing. "What good will that do?" She smiled, her manner gentle but firm. "Sometimes, Sir Henry, seeing things again brings clarity. People reveal more than they intend when they're asked to retrace their steps." Reluctantly, he agreed, sensing in her quiet certainty a wisdom he could not dismiss. At tea she outlined the plan to the guests, her voice mild but commanding attention. "We shall each return to our places from that first evening," she said, "and recount our movements after dinner. It may jog a memory, or reveal something overlooked." The suggestion was met with unease. Blake grumbled about parlour games. Gray's pen paused mid-stroke. Langston's smile tightened, and Hurst adjusted her glasses with a frown. Celia, her hands trembling, nodded silently. Miss Marple noted each reaction, her mind cataloguing the flickers of discomfort. The reenactment took place in the drawing room, the empty case a silent witness. The guests, at Miss Marple's direction, took their positions from the night of the unveiling. Sir Henry by the case, Celia at his side, Blake near the fire, Gray at a writing desk, Langston by the mantel, Hurst near the bookcase. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, watched as they recounted their movements. Blake claimed he'd gone straight to his room, his headache worsening. Gray insisted she'd written until dawn, her door locked. Langston repeated his tale of a garden stroll, though his eyes avoided the French windows. Hurst said she'd lingered in the library, studying manuscripts. Celia, her voice barely audible, spoke of her nightmare and the scream. As they moved through the room, Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. Gray hesitated near the French windows, her hand brushing the latch as if by instinct. Langston lingered by the case, his fingers tracing its edge where the rouge smudge had been. Hurst's steps faltered near the bookcase, her gaze flicking to the loose panel Miss Marple had noticed. Blake's bluster seemed forced, his eyes darting to Celia. "They're all hiding something," Miss Marple thought, "but one is hiding more." After the reenactment, she spoke privately with Sir Henry in his study. "The dagger," she said, her tone measured, "is still in this house, but it's not the dagger they're after." Sir Henry frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her eyes bright. "Let us say the dagger is a key to something else, a secret perhaps, or a truth someone wishes to keep hidden. Announce tonight that the dagger has been found and will be displayed again. Watch their faces, Sir Henry. They will tell you more than words." He agreed, though skepticism lingered in his eyes. At dinner he made the announcement, his voice carrying over the clink of glasses. "Good news all," he said. "The dagger has been recovered and will be returned to its case tomorrow evening. We'll have no more of this nonsense." The effect was immediate. Gray's fork slipped, clattering to her plate. Langston's wineglass trembled, a drop spilling onto the cloth. Hurst excused herself abruptly, claiming fatigue. Blake's laugh was too loud. Celia's face paled further. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, noted each reaction, her mind weaving the threads tighter. A trap, she thought, is only as good as the bait. As the guests retired, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her eyes on the empty case. The announcement had stirred the pot, and she sensed the culprit, or culprits, would act tonight, driven by fear or greed. She recalled the loose panel, Langston's search, Gray's candles, the rouge that matched no one's face. It's always the little things, she thought, that betray the heart's intent. Settling into her chair, she prepared to wait, her knitting a pretext, her senses alert to the house's whispers. The night, she knew, would bring the truth closer to the surface. Chapter 7. The Dagger Revealed. The evening at Norbury Hall carried a charge, as if the very air anticipated the reckoning Miss Jane Marple had set in motion. The drawing-room, lit once more by the chandelier's warm glow, seemed to pulse with secrets. The empty case, a silent taunt to the gathered guests. Sir Henry's announcement at dinner that the jewelled dagger had been recovered and would be displayed again had stirred a restless undercurrent, and Miss Marple, seated in a shadowed corner with her knitting, watched the ripples spread. Her trap was set, and she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that someone would act before the night was out. The guests assembled after dinner, their faces a study in strained civility. Sir Henry stood by the hearth, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of defiance and unease. Lady Celia, her auburn hair pinned tightly, sat with her hands clasped, her gaze flickering to the empty case as if it held a ghost. Major Reginald Blake, his brandy glass in hand, muttered about damned theatrics, though his eyes betrayed a nervous glint. Miss Lavinia Gray, her notebook abandoned for once, perched on the edge of a chair, her sharp features taut with expectation. Mr. Victor Langston, his smile brittle, leaned against the mantel, his cigarette burning forgotten in his fingers. Dr. Evelyn Hurst, her glasses reflecting the candlelight, stood near the bookcase, her silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, observed them all. The announcement had done its work. Gray's earlier fumble with her fork, Langston's spilled wine, Hurst's abrupt exit, Blake's forced laugh, Celia's pallor, each was a thread in the tapestry she was weaving. People, she thought, cannot help but reveal themselves when they think the game is up. She had instructed Sir Henry to claim the dagger was locked in his study, a lie designed to flush out the thief. Constable Polk, at her quiet suggestion, waited in the hall, his presence concealed by the heavy drapes. The conversation was desultory, punctuated by awkward silences. Blake attempted a story about his military days, but it fell flat. Gray, unusually quiet, watched Celia with a novelist's intensity, as if memorizing her fear. Langston made a jest about curses, but his eyes lingered on the study door. Hurst, when pressed by Sir Henry about the dagger's history, spoke briefly of its dark legacy. Her voice clipped. Miss Marple, feigning absorption in her knitting, noted the way Hurst's hand brushed the bookcase near the loose panel she had discovered. As the clock struck 11, a faint creak sounded from the direction of the study. Miss Marple's needles paused, her senses sharp. She caught Polk's eye through a gap in the drapes, signalling him to stay alert. The guests continued their charade of conversation, but their eyes darted, their movements restless. Then a sharper sound, a soft click as of a lock being tested. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping to the chair, and moved toward the hall, her steps silent. The others, caught in their own distractions, did not notice. In the corridor, she glimpsed a figure at the study door, a hairpin glinting in the dim light. It was Miss Gray, her face pale, her hands steady despite the risk. "Oh, Miss Gray," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying just enough to startle. "You really should have worn less rouge." Gray froze, the hairpin slipping from her fingers. Before she could speak, Polk emerged from the shadows, his notebook at the ready. "Now, miss," he said, his tone firm, "let's have no more of this." The drawing room erupted in chaos as the others rushed to the scene. Sir Henry's face was thunderous. Celia's hands flew to her mouth. Blake swore loudly. Langston's cigarette fell to the floor, and Hurst's glasses slipped down her nose. Gray, cornered, tried to laugh it off. "A misunderstanding," she said, her voice shrill. "I was only checking the door." But Miss Marple's mild gaze held her fast. "A misunderstanding," she said, "does not require a hairpin, nor leave rouge on a glass case." The truth unravelled swiftly, as it often did when the mask was lifted. Miss Gray, desperate for funds to sustain her writing career, had plotted to steal the dagger and sell it through Langston, whose connections in the black market were an open secret. The scream, Miss Marple revealed, had been Celia's, orchestrated by Gray to create a diversion. Celia, tearful, admitted her part, confessing that Gray had preyed on her fears about the dagger's curse and her strained marriage, promising her freedom in exchange for cooperation. The dagger, however, had never left the house. It was hidden behind the loose panel in the library, a fact Miss Marple had deduced from the scuff marks, the blue thread, and Jenny's account of Gray's candles. Langston, implicated as Gray's accomplice, crumbled under Polk's questioning, admitting he'd planned to broker the sale, but had lost his nerve. Dr. Hurst, it emerged, had suspected the plot and tried to warn Sir Henry, but her reticence and fear of being misunderstood had silenced her. The rouge smudge, Miss Marple explained, was Gray's, applied hastily to mask her pallor during the theft, a detail she'd overlooked in her haste. The blue thread matched a shawl Gray had worn, caught as she moved the dagger to its hiding place. Sir Henry, his anger giving way to exhaustion, sank into a chair. "You've saved me, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. She smiled, her eyes kind but sharp. "Not saved, Sir Henry," she said. "Merely clarified. People are so careless with their secrets." Polk, with a newfound respect, took Grey and Langston into custody, while Celia, sobbing, promised to make amends. Hurst, quietly relieved, offered a nod of gratitude, and Blake, for once, had no bluster to offer. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the drawing-room quiet once more. The dagger, retrieved from its hiding place, was locked away, its curse no match for human folly. "It's always the little things," she thought, her needles resuming their rhythm, "that bring the truth to light." Chapter 8. The Quiet of Chipping Norbury. The morning sun broke gently over Chipping Norbury, casting a soft glow on the thatched roofs and dew-kissed lanes of the village. Miss Jane Marple, back in her cottage after the tumultuous weekend at Norbury Hall, sat by her window, her knitting once more in her hands. The soft pink wool of her shawl had grown under her nimble fingers, its pattern as intricate as the puzzle she had just unravelled. Outside, the village stirred with its usual rhythm, Mrs. Carter gossiping at the post office, the vicar tending his roses. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on the events that had unfolded, the secrets laid bare in the grand old house up the hill. The case of the jewelled dagger had been settled, though not without its cost. Constable Park, with a newfound deference to Miss Marple's insight, had taken Miss Lavinia Grey and Mr. Victor Langston into custody, their confessions spilling out like coins from a torn purse. Miss Grey, driven by desperation to fund her literary ambitions, had orchestrated the theft, her sharp mind devising a plan that relied on Lady Celia's fears and Langston's greed. The scream, a calculated distraction, had been Celia's, coerced by Grey's promises of escape from a marriage that had grown cold under Sir Henry's obsession with his relics. Langston, with his black market connections, had been the intended broker, though his cowardice had left the dagger hidden rather than sold. The dagger itself, retrieved from behind the library's loose panel, was now locked in Sir Henry's safe, its rubies dulled by the scandal it had provoked. Dr. Evelyn Hurst, her suspicions vindicated, had returned to her archaeological work, her quiet gratitude expressed in a brief note to Miss Marple. Major Reginald Blake, his bluster deflated, had left Norbury Hall with mutterings about bad company. Celia, chastened but lighter, had promised to mend her ways, though Miss Marple suspected the Ashfords' marriage would not survive the strain. Sir Henry, his pride wounded, had vowed to secure his collection more carefully, though his eyes held a weariness that spoke of deeper troubles. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, reflected on the affair. The rouge smudge, the scuff marks, the blue thread, Jenny's candles, Langston's midnight search, the loose panel, each had been a clue, small but vital, leading her to the truth. "People," she said to her cat Tuppence, who purred contentedly on the windowsill, "think they can hide their motives, but the little things always betray them." Tuppence blinked, as if in agreement, and Miss Marple smiled, her mind already drifting to the village's quieter mysteries. She rose to make tea, her movements brisk despite the long weekend. The cottage was warm, its familiar comforts a balm after the grandeur and deceit of Norbury Hall. As the kettle whistled, she thought of Celia, so young and so easily swayed, and of Grey, whose ambition had outstripped her caution. "It's always the same," she mused, pouring water into the teapot. "Greed, fear, love, they pull the strings and people dance." The village clock chimed noon, and Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her tea steaming beside her. Chipping Norbury, with its gossip and its secrets, was peaceful once more. But she knew it would not stay so. Every village, every heart, held its own mysteries, waiting for a keen eye to unravel them. She picked up her knitting, her fingers moving with the ease of habit, and turned her gaze to the garden, where a sparrow hopped among the roses. "Another day," she said softly, "and another story.